December 1938. 5 men sit around a campfire on the border of Tibet. The temperature has dropped well below freezing. They haven't seen another human being in weeks. Around them, there's only sky, snow, and silence. Officially, they were scientists, a zoologist, a geologist, a botanist, an entomologist, the guy who catches insects. And then there's one that called himself a physical anthropologist. He has a suitcase full of calipers, measuring tapes, and diagrams of skull shapes. Unofficially, they were SS officers in civilian clothes sent by Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, the man with the round glasses who looks like an accountant but wields more powers than most generals. Himmler believes that the Aryan race, his race, descends from Atlantis, that survivors from the sunken continent fled into the Himalayas, and they were hiding up there in the snow, in the fog. He had sent 5 men to find the proof. There's only one problem. It's a lie. There is no Aryans in Tibet. Himmler is wrong. But therefore, the year is out. That mistake cost millions of people their lives. My name is René, and you are listening to Ancient Aliens, Lost Civilizations. Today, we are not talking about gods from the outer space. We are talking about something much more down to earth and much more frightening. The Nazis, Himmler, the SS, the hunt for the Holy Grail, Atlantis, rune magic, and a castle in Westphalia that is now a museum, but that some still call the strongholds of the Black Sun. We are going to examine what's facts, what's interpretation, and what is pure myth-making from the years after the war. And yes, I will inadvertently mispronounce half of the German names. That is the price of doing a podcast in English when your sources are in German, as a Danish, and I will do my best. But you have to forgive for the rest. Let's begin. May 1933, Nazi students, SA men, and Hitler youth gathered on university squares all over Germany. They were carrying torches, they were carrying books, they throw them on the fire. There are in famous book burnings, feud, Reich, Einstein, everything that's un-German must be burned. Most people know about that. But what a few people know is that while the books are burning, other texts were being studied in the deepest secrecy. Old Icelandic sagas were gods and heroes, medieval Grail legends, esoteric theses on runes, divination, and the sunken civilization on Atlantis. Because the Nazis weren't just a political party, they were, in their own minds, the beginning of a new religion, a religion that would replace Christianity, preach the sanctity of the blood and soil and the identity of the German people as the Aryan race last hope. For decades after World War II, historians have debated how seriously we should take the Nazis' interest in the occult. Was it a genuine belief, or was it just a way to manipulate the masses? Was Himmler a madman who wasted millions on nonsense? Or was he a cynical propagandist who knew that myth bind people together and he could use them to create an unbreakable loyalty around the Führer? The answer is, as often in the cases with the history, more complicated. Today we are going down the rabbit hole, but we are going to do it with a cold head and the sources laid out in front of us. We are going to visit the Wewelsburg Castle, Himmler's so-called Camelot. We are going to follow the Grail hunter Otto Rahn into the caves of the Pyrenees. We are going with the SS researchers to the Tibet, where they measured skulls to find the Aryans, and we are going to talk about this search for the mystical past ended in something that wasn't mythical. It was very real and it was horrifying. Along the way, we will distinguish between what we know with high certainty and what is more uncertain. Because as we will see, some of the wildest stories about the Nazi occultism emerged after the war. Others, less well known, are unfortunately quite real. Let's start where the story begins, in the back alleys of Vienna, in a small journal called Ostrara, and a man named Jürgen Lanz von Leibniz. To understand Himmler's fascinations of the occult, we first have to understand Germany and Austria in the late 19th century. Industrialization has transformed Europe. Millions of peasants flooded into the cities. Old hierarchies, kings, nobility, church lost their grip. Science challenged religion. Darwin has called into the question humanity's special status. The cities grew, and with them came slums, poverty, and a feeling that something has been lost. For many Germans and Austrians, the loss was something quite concrete. They missed a world that made sense, a world with order, beauty, and spirituality. In this atmosphere, a wave of Lebensreform, life reform, emerged. Thousands of young people joined the Wandervogel, the Birds of Passage, a movement that celebrated the German landscape, folklore, and ancient rituals. They turned their backs on the industrial civilization. They became vegetarians, nudists, meditation practitioners, and many of them began to take an interest in the occult. In the middle of this milieu, two figures emerged who has enormous significance for the later Nazi Germany. The first was Guido von List, born in Vienna in 1848. List claimed to have occult vision in which he saw ancient Germans and their rune magic. He practically invented a whole religion around the runes. Old Germanic symbols, interpreting them into magical signs. He created the doctrine of the Armenschaft, a secret priestly caste that has been prevented by the original Iron's wisdoms for the centuries. According to List, Christianity has suppressed this wisdom, but now, in the late 19th century, the time has come to revive it. The second was Jürgen Lanz from Lebensfeld, born in 1874. Lanz was a former Cistercian monk who had left the church to found his own order. He called his doctrine the zoology, a god doctrine of the races. And this where it become really strange. According to Lanz, the Iron race descended from the godmen who once lived on Atlantis. These godmen has possessed telepathic abilities, supernatural powers, and they were practical gods themselves. But then something happened. Some of the Irons has mated with animals, others with subhumans. The blood has been polluted. The result? The Jews, the Slavs, the Gypsies, so on. All the inferior races were, according to Lanz, the product of this radical mixing. Lanz's solution was simple and terrifying. The pure iron had to breed like animals. Polygamy should be introduced for the best. Women with good iron blood should become broad mothers, birthing iron children for the nation's benefit. The inferior should be sterilized or sent to Madagascar, or, and here Lanz uses the word himself, incinerated. It sounds like a sick fantasy, and it was. But Lanz had his own journal, Ostrara, distributed across the German-speaking world. He claimed to sell over 100,000 copies a year. Historians think the number was lower, but it was still significant. And one of his regular readers was a young, starving artist in Vienna named Adolf Hitler. We don't know for certain whenever Hitler ever met Lanz in person. There is a photograph supposed from 1909 that shows a young man in a cloak, which some claim is Hitler, at some occult ceremony, but the photo is uncertain, purely dated, and many historians dismissed it as a later forgery. What we do know is that Hitler read Otto Rahn. We know he took his collections of issues with him when he moved from Vienna to Munich in 1913. And we know that in Mein Kampf, he wrote the struggle of the races in a way that mirrors Lanz's idea. But he never mentioned Lanz by name. And that is worth nothing. Hitler was never himself a member of any occult lodge. He never attended seances. He didn't perform rituals. Himmler was a different story entirely. After World War I, a network of secret society emerged in Germany, all influenced by Linz, Last, and Blavatsky. The Russian-American... Sorry for the interruption. I'll take this section again. After World War I, a network of secret societies emerged in Germany, all influenced by Liszt, Lanz, and Blavatsky, the Russian-American occultist who had written about the root races and the swastika as an iron symbol. The most famous of these societies was the Thule Gesellschaft, the Thule Society. In Greek mythology, Thule was the mythical land in the far north, interpreted by the Nazis as the Iron race place of origin. The Thule Society symbol was the swastika. Its members were wealthy aristocrats, industrial magnates, high-ranking officers, and so on. Its goal was to fight democracy, socialism, and Judaism, and to prepare for a new Iron Age. Thule helped finance the small party that later would become the NSDAP, the Nazi Party. One of its members, a man named Dietrich Eckart, took Hitler under his wing. Eckart was a poet, a translator, and occultist. He introduced Hitler to the wealthy backers, taught him rhetoric, and planted the seeds that would later become the Nazi blood and soil religion. Eckart died in 1923. His last verse supposedly, "Follow Hitler, he will dance, but it is I who have written the music. I have given him the means to communicate with the higher. Bless him and pray for us." That's quite a quote. The problem is that no one knows if it's genuine. It first appeared in a book in the 1930s, written by one of Hitler's early followers. The source level is what we in the trade call heresy. But even if the quote is questionable, the point is clear. Nazis wasn't born in a vacuum. It grew out of the environment where occultism, race theory, and esotericism was a common currency. So, the official narrative took a form to something like this. Nazism emerged in the wake of the Treaty of Versailles, the Great Depression, the fear of communism, and a deep national humiliation. Occultism was a part of the intellectual milieu, sure, but it wasn't decisive. Himmler was an eccentric, Hitler was more pragmatic, more cynical, and Arius Salvi, the race mystical doctrine that was ultimately just a side note. Decoration for an ideology was really about power, terror, and war. That is the official narrative. And it isn't wrong, but there are holes, some holes. Let's start with one of the bigger holes. Let's travel to Wewelsburg Castle. Wewelsburg Castle is in Westphalia near the town of Paderborn. It was built in the 16th century, but stands on the ruins of a fortress from the 18th century. In 1934, a year after the Nazis took power, Himmler got the castle for a symbolic rent of 1 Reichsmark a year. It was a steal. The castle was beautifully situated, full of history, and one of the most important of it all, it was close to the Teutoburg forest. Here in the year 9 AD, Germanic tribe had wiped out 3 Roman legions. For Himmler, this was sacred ground, a place where the Germans has defeated the decadent southern European civilization. Himmler spent millions of Reichsmark remodeling Wewelsburg. He hired architects, craftsmen, architects. He had furniture, weapons, armor brought in from all over Germany, anything that could give the castle a Germanic feel. Later, after the war broke out in 1939, he also used concentration camp prisoners. In a small camp right next to the castle, up to 4,000 prisoners slaved away day and night to dig a moat, build walls, and lay rows. Over 1,200 of them died. Most of them were Jehovah's Witnesses, not Jews. Why? Because Jehovah's Witnesses refused to bear arms and were easy to suppress, and because they were known to be good workers who did not try to escape. There's a detail most documentaries about the Nazis occult castles leaves out, but it's important because Wewelsburg was not just a playground for Himmler's fantasies. It was also a project built on slave labor and human suffering. The castle's north tower was the centerpiece of Himmler's plans. He had a room built called the Obergruppen. I try again. This is German. Obergruppenführsaal, the hall of the supreme leaders. 12 pillars, 12 niches along the walls, and on the floor a dark green sun with 12 spokes. Today, the symbol is called the Black Sun. It becomes a favorite emblem for the neo-Nazis and the Satanists worldwide. What it actually means is disputed. Some think it represents a sun wheel, an old Germanic symbol. Others interpret it as a reference to the 12 SS general who was supposed to form a kind of modern-day Knights of the Round Table. Beneath the hall, in the crypt, Himmler built an even more mysterious room, a circular chamber with space for 12 urns along the walls. In the center, a depression where an eternal flame was supposed to burn. According to the stories, the 12 urns were to contain the ashes of the deceased SS generals. The flames were to symbolize the order's eternal life, and the ceremonies, well, yeah, there are plenty of rumors about those. Some former SS men told stories after the war that Himmler and his 12 closest generals would sit in silence for hours and meditate, or receive telepathic messages from the ancestors. Other mentions shenanigans, rune magic, sacrifice. There's even one that claimed that Himmler believed that he could communicate with King Heinrich I, the medieval king he saw as his own reincarnation. The question is there any substance to these stories? The museum at Wewelsburg today is very much aware of this problem. I'm quoting the museum director from a BBC documentary. You can't stop the legends, you can only enlighten people, but it's difficult to work against conspiracy theories. In the museum, they show the Black Sun, but they put back on top of it so you could not stand and admire it. They deconstruct the symbols. They show that the 12 niches were never finished, that the crypt was never used, that the eternal flame was never lit. Because here's the thing. Work on Wewelsburg stopped in 1943. The reason was the defeated Stalingrad. Hitler issued a decree that all non-war essential construction projects should be halted, and Wewelsburg was one of them. The grand rituals, if they were ever planned, never took place. We only have one single well-documented gathering of SS leaders at Wewelsburg. That was in June, from the 12th to the 15th in 1941. 1 week before the attack of the Soviet Union. The meeting wasn't about occultism, it was about planning the war in the East. Himmler gave a speech in which he urged his general to prepare for eliminate 30 million Slavs. The words are quoted in the minute of the meeting. So when people today talk about the Nazis' occult rituals at Wewelsburg, there is a reason to be skeptical. There are no primary sources describing such rituals, only eyewitness accounts given by former SS men decades after the war, men who had every reason to embellish their stories. But that doesn't mean that the interest in the occult was insignificant, because there were other parts of this story that is far better documented. Let's meet the Grail hunter. Let's meet Otto Rahn. Otto Rahn was born in 1904 in a small German town of Michelstadt. He grew up during World War I and the terrible years that followed. Like many young people of that area, he sought refuge in myth, old sagas, King Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table. His favorite story was Parsifal, the young knight who searched for the Holy Grail, written by Wolfram von Eschenbach in the 13th century. Percival eventually finds the Grail, not as a cup, but as a stone that falls from heaven and grants eternal life. For most people, it's just a legend, but for Rahn, he took it literally. He believed that Parsifal was a real person, or at least one based on real people. That Eschenbach's poem contains a secret code, and that the Grail was a real object hidden somewhere in Europe. In 1931, Rahn traveled to the southern France, to the Pyrenees, where the area where the locally called the Grail country. There he found the fortress ruin of Montségur, built on the top of a steep mountain surrounded by frost and mist. In the 13th century, Montségur was the last bastion of the Christian sect known as the Cathars. The Cathars believed in two gods, a good god of spirit and an evil god of matter. They rejected the Pope, the bishop, the entire hierarchy of the Catholic Church. The Pope called them heretics. In 1209, he ordered a bloody crusade against them. Over 100,000 people were killed in the following decades. In 1244, after a 10-month siege, the last Cathars surrendered at Montségur. Several hundred were burned at the stake on the foot of the mountain. But the legend is that 4 Cathars escaped the night before with something very valuable. Rahn became convinced that this something was the Grail. He spent years exploring the caves around Montségur. He crawled through narrow passages down into underground chambers to petroglyphs that no one has seen for centuries. In his notebook, he sketched a pentagram, a 5-pointed star carved into the rock in the cave called the Bethlehem Grotto. He found human skeletons in which he believed were the Cathars' remains, but he never found the Grail. Rahn ran out of money. He had to return to Germany. In 1933, the same year as Hitler came to power, he published a book about his experience, Crusade Against the Grail. The book didn't sell particularly well, but one reader was deeply fascinated, Heinrich Himmler. Rahn received a telegram. Your book is very interesting. I would like to talk to you. Come to Berlin. The address was Prince Albertstraße 7, SS headquarters. Rahn went to Berlin. He walked through the door, and there, behind the desk, sat Heinrich Himmler himself. Himmler offered Rahn 1,000 Reichsmark for a month, a fortune at the time, to continue his research. There is only one condition: he had to join the SS. Rahn said yes. In the years 1935-1936, Rahn traveled with a small SS troop through Europe, Italy, France, Spain, Scotland, Iceland. Officially, he was a researcher studying old texts and ruins. Unofficially, he was looking for the Grail. His reports were top secret. Only Himmler and his closest advisors read them. In 1937, Rahn published his second book, Lucifer's Court. And here is it where it becomes complicated, because the crusade against the Grail was relatively neutral description of the Cathars and his own research. Lucifer's Court was more Nazi. Rahn now wrote about the Cathars as the iron resistance fighters against the Jewish Rome. He wrote about the purity of the blood, the sanity of the race. He quoted Himmler and used the same language as the party propaganda. The question is, did he believe it, or was he just writing something to please Hitler? We know that Rahn had two secrets. First of all, he was homosexual. In Nazi Germany, homosexuality could send you straight to a concentration camp. The pink triangle was one of the most hated symbols in the camps. And if you don't know, all prisoners in the concentration camp had a triangle. I think there was 8 or 10 different colors indicating what you are there for. You could be anything from a gypsy to homosexual to Jews and so on. And they could even be combined. And out of that, I continue. The second was that his mother, Clara, was of Jewish descent. Rahn had to make a deal with the great devil. He got money, he got status, he got freedom to research. In return, he had to hide who he was, and he had to find the Grail, but he couldn't deliver. In 1937, Rahn was transferred. He was no longer traveling around looking for holy relics. He was to work in the concentration camp, first Dachau, then Buchenwald. Exactly what he did there, we don't know. Officially, he was a guard, but some sources suggest that he also worked as a secretary or an archivist. Whatever the case, he saw what SS really was. He saw the imprisoned, sick, starving prisoners. He heard the shots from the executions. He smelled the smoke from the crematorium. Rahn was broken. He wrote a letter to his friend. To a friend. I have much sorrow in my country. Impossible for a tolerant liberal man like me to live in a nation that my home country has become. In 1939, Rahn tried to leave the SS. He wrote a resignation letter. It was, in reality, a death sentence. He traveled to Austria, to the Alps. In the middle of the winter, he walked into the mountains wearing his black SS uniform, some say, with a bottle of whiskey and some sleeping pills. He sat down under a tree, took the pills, drank the whiskey, and froze to death. He was 34 years old. Rahn believed to the very end that the Grail lay hidden in a cave near Montségur, protected by a large stone and hundreds of vipers, and he wrote in his book, he was wrong. But his story doesn't end there, because Himmler's search for the Grail didn't end with Rahn's death. In 1944, in the middle of the war, Himmler sent one of his most famous commandos, Otto Rahn, to Montségur. Skorsky was the man who had freed Mussolini from a mountain hotel in 1943. He was a legend, feared, admired, fearless. Officially, he was to search for the Grail. According to the stories, Skorsky discovered a secret route down the cliff, the way that the Cathars has escaped. He followed the trail, found the cave, and there in an underground crypt it stood, the Holy Grail, an emerald green bowl glittering in the darkness. Skorsky sent it to Himmler. Himmler sent it to the U-boat to Antarctica, to a secret nature base in the ice. It's a fantastic story. There's just one problem. It's a lie. The story comes from an American author named Howard Buchner, who in 1991 published a book called The Emerald Cup. Buchner claimed that a young SS doctor in 1945 had obtained the that a young Buchner claimed that as a young doctor in 1945, he had obtained the information from a captured SS officer. The problem is, we know that Otto Rahn was not in France in March 1944. He was in Yugoslavia, where the Germans was engaged in heavy fighting. There is troop movements reports that confirms it. Buchner's story is, to put it bluntly, an invention. But why would anybody invent such a story? That brings us to an important question. Why are we so fascinated by the Nazis' occultism? Why do we want to believe that they had secret weapons, medical rituals, contact with extraterrestrials? Maybe because it makes them more interesting. Maybe because it explains evil in a way that is easier to understand than the banal truth. That they were bureaucrats. That they planned genocide in spreadsheets. That they were, in essence, ordinary people doing horrible, terrible things. But we mustn't let the fascination overshadow reality, because reality is far more frightening than the Grail legend. The Grail hunt is one rabbit hole. There are many more. Let's take the most famous one, Atlantis. According to Plato, Atlantis was a large island or a continent west of the Straits of Gibraltar, sunk into the sea thousands of years ago. For most historians, Atlantis is a myth, an allegory about an arrogant society punished by the gods. But for Himmler, Atlantis was real. In the mid-1930s, Himmler encountered an eccentric historian named Hermann Witt. Witt claimed to have found evidence for Atlantis not in the Atlantic, but in northern Europe. According to Witt, Atlantis was the great Nordic civilization destroyed by a natural catastrophe. Survivors had to flee to every corner of the world, and they brought the iron culture with them. Witt pointed to petroglyphs in Sweden, to ancient symbols in Germany, mysterious signs in Africa. All of it, he said, was the remnant of a lost civilization. Himmler was thrilled. In 1935, he joined forces with Witt to establish the Anerbe, the ancestral heritage. It was the SS' own think tank. Archaeologists, historians, anthropologists, physicians, all of them were to work to prove the superiority of the Aryan race. The Anerbe grew into over 50 departments with about 200 researchers. It was an impressive apparatus, but the results were, shall we say, lacking. The archaeologists dug into the existence, a rock formation in Germany that has been a pagan holy site. They found nothing that could prove an ancient Aryan civilization. The historians searched for evidence that Jesus was an Aryan, not a Jew. They found nothing. The anthropologists measured skulls and eye color all over Europe. They found no systematic difference between races that could justify Himmler's theories. Nevertheless, Himmler kept funding them, millions of Reichsmark year after year. Why? Because Anerbe was not about science, it was about religion. Himmler wanted to replace Christianity with a new Germanic faith. Christianity, he said, was Jewish, decadent, it was debilitating, it forced people to turn the other cheek instead of fighting for the race. The new faith was to draw inspiration from the Norse mythology, gods like Odin, Thor, Balder, solstice ritual, rune magic, the worship of blood and soil, Blut und Boden. The Anerbe was to provide the scientific foundation for the faith, and they did it by forging evidence. There's a famous example. In 1936, Himmler sent an expedition to Sweden to study petroglyphs. The expedition took over 100 plaster casts of stones with symbols, and Wirth concluded that they were the remains of the forgotten iron scripts. But when other archaeologists examined the cast, it turns out that Wirth has, shall we say, improved them. He had drawn symbols that weren't there. He had changed the direction of the runes. He had created evidence that didn't actually exist. It wasn't science, it was wishful thinking, or perhaps just fraud. Another rabbit hole, the Tibet. In 1938, Himmler sent 5 SS researchers to the Himalayas. Officially, they were to study Tibetan culture, geology, or wildlife. Unofficially, and it was clear from the expedition papers, they were to search for the traces of the iron blood. The anthropologist Bruno Beger measured the Tibetan skulls, eyes, noses, hair. He took face casts, he compared them to German measurement. His conclusion is that there were traces of the Nordic races in Tibet. Today we know that Beger's conclusion was scientifically unfounded. There was no Nordic race. There was no objective measurement that could separate an iron from a Jew. This was pseudoscience from start to finish. But the expedition was a success for Himmler. First, it was a propaganda triumph. They were the first German to reach Lhasa, Tibet's holy city. Second, and more importantly, the expedition proved that the Nerve could be used to legitimize Himmler's ideas. Hitler, who otherwise teased Himmler about his Teutonic nonsense, was impressed. He met the expedition members personally at the airport. But there is a third rabbit hole, and perhaps the darkest one. Because the Nerve was not just pseudoscience and silly expeditioners, it was also a cover for something more: heinous crimes of the Holocaust. In 1942, Himmler ordered a collection of Jewish skeletons. The purpose? To prove the biological difference between Jews and Aryans, to create a scientific reference collection that could be used to identify Jews, even when they tried to hide. The task was given to Professor August Hirt, head of the Anatomical Institute of Strasbourg. Hirt was already notorious for his experiments on living prisoners. And to help select the skeletons, he got assistance from Bruno Beger, the same anthropologist who had measured skulls in Tibet. In the summer of 1943, Beger arrived at Auschwitz. He was allowed to review thousands of prisoners. He measured them, he took notes, he selected. 86 people were chosen: men, women, teenagers. They were sent to the Natzweiler Stutthof concentration camp in France. In August 1943, they were murdered in the gas chambers. Afterwards, the bodies were sent to Strasbourg, where Hitz stored them in vats of formaldehyde. He planned to dissect them, clean the bones, and display the skeletons in a museum as proof of Jewish inferiority. The project was never finished. The war ended. Hirt fled and later committed suicide. But the remains were found. For decades, they lay hidden in the Institute of Strasbourg. It was until 2015 that they were identified and buried with dignity. The story of these 86 people is almost forgotten. They have no gravestones. Their name appears now nowhere. Maybe you know some of them: Elisabeth Klein, 42, from Vienna; Moses Bernstein, 53, from Poland; Sarah Goldberg, 19, from Hungary. They were the victims of an ideology that became with myth, Atlantis, the Grail, the Iron Race, and entering the gas chambers. That is important to remember. Because when we talk today about the Nazis' occult, occult secrets, there is a darker side that we forget the victims, that we turn the Nazis into something mystical instead of seeing them as what they were bureaucrats, executioners, people who use myth to justify unthinkable acts. And now it's time to turn to the skeptics, the serious historians, because they will say, yes, Himmler was interested in the occult, but he was the exception. Most Nazis weren't exoterists. Himmler made fun of Himmler, of his Teutonic nonsense behind his back. Albert Speer testified this in his memoirs. They will say that the Nuremberg archaeology was forced and didn't stand up to scientific scrutiny, that the Sweden expedition was embarrassing, that the Tibet expedition yielded no results, that the money was wasted, and Himmler knew it. They will say that the rituals at Wewelsburg largely didn't happen, that there isn't a single primary source describing the occult rituals there, that the 12 niches were never used, that the eternal flame was never lit, that the black sun was a concept that first appeared in the 1990s in a book about German esotericism, not in Nazi Germany. And most importantly, the Holocaust didn't require occultism. It required bureaucracy, railway planning, gas technology. It required ordinary people, doctors, engineers, accountants, and so on to do the job while millions dies. The historian Nicholas Godric Clark, who wrote the standard work, The Occult Root of the Nazism, put it in this way. Ariosophy was a side issue. It influenced Himmler's atheist, but not his politics. His politics was driven by power, territory, and race, and not by rune magic. That is a strong argument. But here's my objection, or should we say observation. It overlooked the fact that the ideology came from somewhere. Hitler read Ostrava. Himmler read List Blavatsky. They believed that the hierarchy of the races because they had a mythology that supported it. Without the mythology, without the idea of the Iron Race as godmen of Jews was subhumans, their politics would have lacked its, should we say, sacred justification. You can't say that the occultism was a decoration, but a decoration also influences. If you spend 10 years talking about the destiny of the Iron Race in front of a podium adorned with the runes and swastikas, you start believing in it, or at least to the act that as if you do. Let me give you a concrete example of the problem. After the war, many of the Nuremberg archaeologists, anthropologists were never punished. They returned to the universities. They continued with their careers. They wrote textbooks. They trained new generations. Bruno Bierga, the one that measured skulls in Tibet and who selected victims for the skeletons collections, was never brought to a trial before the 1970s. He was convicted as accomplice to murder. The sentence, 3 years probation. He lived as a free man until his death in 2009. The story of these people isn't over. Their ideas about race, about heredity, about superior and inferior humans lives on in far-right circles, on the internet, and so on. So when historians say that the occultism is a side issue, they are right in a way. But when I look into the consequences, the 86 skeletons in Strasbourg, the 6 million Jews, the 22 million Slavs, Roman, homosexuals, the disabled, I have to ask, Was it really a side issue, or was it the engines? The narrative that made ordinary people believe that they were carrying out a sacred mission? I don't know, but I do know that we mustn't close our eyes to the question. So, what actually holds up? Let me try to sort things out. What do we know with certainty? What is probable and what is speculation or outright myth? First, Himmler created the Annerbe. That is documented in thousands of pages from the SS archives, many of them preserved in the Bundesarchiv in Berlin. Second, Himmler remodeled Wewelsburg Castle, building plans, accounts, photographs, all confirmed. Third, the SS has its own ritual, weddings, child naming ceremonies, death head rings. There are photos and descriptions of these ceremonies. They weren't particularly occult, but they were ritualized and designed to create a new tradition. Fourth, the Annerbe sent expedition to Tibet, Sweden, Finland, Croatia, Iraq. The list is long. The travel reports are in the archive. Fifth, the Nazis used the swastika, runes, and other Germanic symbols on uniforms, buildings, official materials. Sixth, and most horrifying, the Annerbe participated in medical experiments and killing of concentration camp prisoners. The skeleton collections, the typhus experiments, the high altitude chamber in Dachau, all documented in the Nuremberg documents. If we look at what's probable but not 100% documented, it is that Himmler genuinely believed in his own mythology, that he was reborn as King Heinrich, that runes has magical power, that Atlantis was real. This is evident from his letters, his diaries, his speeches. The question is how deep the belief went. Was he a cynic that used myth to control, or was he a true believer who genuinely thought that he was receiving telepathic messages from the past? Most historians lean forward the latter. Himmler was, despite his cruelty, a romantic. He believed in the supernatural, and that belief made him dangerous. If we go on to speculations without documentations, we have regular scenes from Wewelsburg with contact with deceased iron ancestors. The Royal Society and its contact with extraterrestrials from Aldebaran, Nazi UFOs built with secret technology, the discovery of the Holy Grail or the Ark of the Covenant. All of this come from post-war literature. There is no primary sources, no SS document mentioning UFO, no photos of the Grail, no minutes from seances with aliens. They are myth, entertaining myth, fascinating myth, but myth. And if you look at what is disproven, is that Atlantis did not exist in a Nordic super race. We know this from geology, from genetics, from archaeology, and from common sense. Jesus was not an iron. Jesus was not an iron. He was Jewish. We know that from all historical sources. There is no evidence for a global iron civilization. Iron is a linguistic term. It means noble in Sanskrit, not a race. Wewelsburg were never finished. The rituals are rare, if ever carried out as planned. The black sun is a magical symbol with a construct from the 1990s, not from the 1930s. So when you hear somebody claim that the Nazis had contact with extraterrestrials or found the Holy Grail, remember this: there is zero evidence. When you hear Wewelsburg was a center of satanic rituals, remember that the best sources say that virtually nothing appears there. But when you hear that the Nazis murdered people in the name of the science, you know it's true. So where does it leave us? The Nazis' occultism was a mixture of genuine belief and cynical propaganda. Himmler was both a bureaucrat who planned the Holocaust and a man who genuinely believed that he was receiving messages from dead kings. It's a strange combination, but humans are strange, and history is rarely pure. The dangerous things about the Nazi mythology wasn't that they believed in the Grail or that they searched for Atlantis or that they had rune on the uniforms. The dangerous things was the mythology justified that other persons were worth less. Once you have built an entire worldview around pure blood and radical soul and the destiny of the Iron civilization, there's no a long step to do cleansing. And this is where the conversation about Nazi occultism should end. Not with UFOs or black suns, not with Indiana Jones style relic hunting, but in the memory that the idea has consequences. That when a powerful man uses myth to define who is human and who is not, it ends in gas chambers. Many of the myths that we have talked about today are live on the internet, on the documentaries, in games like Wolfenstein, which is actually named after Wewelsburg, albeit in a different spelling. Some will say I'm demonizing the Nazis too much. Some will say I'm not demonizing them enough. It's not my job. It's not my job to judge. It's my job to investigate. And my investigation says that the Nazis weren't magicians. They were executioners. But they used the language of magic, myth, simple rituals to explain why the executioners were heroes. And that might be the worst or the most frightening thing of them all. In this episode, I use sources like BBC documentary of Wewelsburg, the original American documents from the Nuremberg Trials, and several other of the major historical works of the Nazi occultism, including Nicholas Godric Clark, the Occult Root of the Nazis, which is still the standard work, even though it came out in 1985. I tried to distinguish between what we know, what we believe, and what we hope. And I hope that you come away with a clear picture. Next time on the Ancient Aliens Lost Civilization, we will try to examine another mystery. So, until then, watch out for myth, even on your own. See you next week.